It's time for our second hour now. Lance made a comment, isn't it funny, or isn't funny, in the standpoint of sad, how some people will depend on the opinion of people like Martin Luther over an inspired writer like James and Paul. And sadly, that's true. And to a certain extent, it's because they have just discounted what James writes altogether. As Luther said, he just took it out of the Bible, said it's not a part of the Bible, it's not a part of the canon, it's an epistle of straw, it's worthless. And then a misunderstanding of what Paul has written because of this. Actually, to a great extent, it was a reaction to Catholicism. And Catholicism's emphasis on a work salvation. And so they went to another extreme, as is so often the case, to there's no works included in salvation. We're saved totally by faith, and really it goes back to Augustinian theology. Calvinism is simply warmed over Augustinianism, and this idea of Calvin or Augustine that man's totally depraved and can't do anything to save himself, can't do anything that's pleasing to God. And so, if you're dealing with works can't save you. You can't do any works that will be pleasing to God anyway. And so, they're eliminated. And it goes back, you start with an incorrect view of God and an incorrect view of man, which is what Augustine did and Calvin did. And no wonder the world's, or religious world's in the shape that it is. And that's why I think a lot of the problems with denominations today are not so much what we so many times see. It goes back to this incorrect view of God and an incorrect view of man. That man's totally depraved, and God's sovereign will, they would put it, man has no action in relationship to God's sovereign will, and God's going to force His will upon man, and man can't do anything about it. And so as a result, works, why, they're excluded. You talk about works, that's a bad word to them. And Howard put the same who tear James out of the Bible will also tear Mark 16:16. Well, they actually go back all the way to verse 9 and tear verse 9 through verse 20 out of the Bible and just eliminate it. And that is sad, and it is correct. They just have no concept of what James is writing. And I will get to that a little bit more as we look at these illustrations that James uses. Getting back now to verse 19. And James' statement, thou believest that there is one God, thou doest well. The devils also believe and tremble. Even though this type of belief is necessary, the type of belief that is a mental assent, it's not sufficient to save an individual. And he says even the devils, King James puts, have this type of belief, but no one expects them to be saved. Devils is from the Greek word daimonion, and it literally means demons. It's not devils per se. In fact, American Standard and New King James both use the word demons, not devils. There are several examples within the New Testament of the demons believing. Matthew the 8th chapter in verse 29, Mark 1 verse 34, Mark 5 verse 6 and verse 7, Luke 8 and verse 28. What if faith alone, just simply mental assent that God is and that Jesus Christ is God's Son, was sufficient to save an individual? Then you've got to have the demons being saved. And no one is willing to agree to that. But yet that's the position of the denominational world today. The word tremble is from the Greek word frizo. And it means to bristle, to stiffen, or to stand up. A good comparison to this word frizo would be the hairs standing on end, as we use the expression. You have something happen and the hairs on your head just stand up, or the hair. That's the idea that's being expressed by this. They tremble. Their hair stands on end. And thus the idea really is to be they are struck with extreme fear. They're horrified. It's the idea of shuddering, just trembling in fear. And it's in the present tense. They continue to tremble. They continue in this way. Verse 20 thus, he says, "But wilt thou know, O vain man, that faith without works is dead." This is the conclusion. Know is from the Greek word gnosko, and it deals with a knowledge that is gained by experience. I see Larry Powers has come in. We appreciate Larry and his good work. And also, I'll put a plug, the work that he did for our lectureship book this year on liberalism, and would encourage anyone to get that book as well. That when it does come out, you'll see his material there. It's excellent material. But here, gnosko, a knowledge that is gained by experience. The word vain is from the Greek word kinos, and it means literally empty-headed. There's nothing in the head. He is empty-headed. And thus, he's really dealing with the man who is not reasoning properly. You know by experience that this individual is not reasoning properly. And we could deal with a great deal the aspect of our need to reason correctly. As Isaiah puts, Isaiah 1:18, "Come now, let us reason together, saith the Lord." And the fact that we are, 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 21, prove all things. Prove has the aspect you reason correctly about all things. Well, this individual, excuse me, this individual who's dealing and saying, "Thou hast faith, I have works," he's not reasoning correctly. He's not reasoning properly. He is holding to a position that very simply cannot be defended. He's void of understanding. And that's the way we feel about a lot of times those in the denominational world who cannot simply understand the very simple principle. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. He said, here's belief and baptism, and there's a conjunction that joins two things of equal value together to be saved. And we point out the denominational world has, he that believeth shall be saved, and then he should be baptized. It's not the same. And they cannot see it. They're void of understanding. That's what James is saying about these individuals who say faith without works. I have my faith, you have works, and we're both all right. He's not reasoning correctly. He's void of understanding. And he's saying that type of faith, faith without works, is incapable of producing anything. There's no indication, no evidence of life or productivity that demonstrates that life is existent. Dead is the Greek word nekros, and while it does mean dead, here it's being used for being destitute of force or power. It's inactive. It's inoperative. That type of faith. The faith that does not produce good works, again, good works in the sense of being obedient to God, is useless. It's inactive. It's destitute of force. It's destitute of power to save a person. We might tie in with that Romans 1:16. The gospel is God's power to save. What is that? Here's power to save, as opposed to being inactive, no, or destitute of force or power, dead, a dead faith, faith that says, I have faith, but I don't have any works. That is destitute of saving us. The gospel and our obedience to the gospel, that obedience of faith, has a power to save. It's not destitute of power. Verse 21 then. Was not Abraham, our father, justified by works when he offered Isaac his son upon the altar? Here's another rhetorical question. That rhetorical question expects an affirmative answer. Yes, he was. Justified is the Greek word dikaio. It's a verb, and it deals with to render righteous, or he is declared to be in a right relationship with God in this sense. And we might tie in with that Matthew, the 12th chapter, and verse 37, where our words justify us. We shall be justified. We shall be declared righteous in a right relationship with God through our words that we use. Well, here, Abraham, by offering up Isaac, proved himself that he believed, or proved that he believed in God. Now, we find this account in Genesis 22nd chapter, and verses 9 through verse 12 of Abraham offering up his son, and I'm having a little bit of trouble. I think the battery in my mouse is going bad, so I might not be able to paste these things into the chat room at this time now. I might try and get going again, but Genesis 22 verses 9 through 12 is the account of that situation. God had instructed Abraham to offer Isaac as a sacrifice to him. Abraham is and he says, was not Abraham our father? Our father here is speaking spiritually of all of those who have the faith of Abraham. And you could go back to Romans, the 4th chapter. You see that same usage of this term. Was not Abraham our father? Father in relationship to having the faith of Abraham. Was he not declared righteous? Declared that he was in a right relationship with God when he said, I have faith? No, it is when he acted in obedience to what God commanded him to do. He did that which God said. He offered Isaac upon the altar. Then in verse 22, he says, seeing thou how faith wrought with his works, and by works was faith made perfect. Wrought is from the Greek word synergio, and it literally means to work with. And here, faith thus wrought with, working with his works, contributed or exercised itself. It contributed to the production of a certain result. Both faith and works cooperated with each other to produce justification or acceptance to or with God. Faith continually exercising itself with works, and out of these works, faith is perfected. And I think I mentioned before in the class as we were dealing with chapter 1, the word perfect is never used in relationship to sinlessness. It is here the word teleoo, and it means complete or finished. Howard said Jesus spoke of the works of Abraham in John 8 and verse 38 or 39. That's true. There's the works of Abraham. To do what? To justify him. His faith with his works, joining together, those two made his faith perfect or complete. It finished his work. In other words, this faith, or finished his faith. The faith would never have been finished if he had not acted in obedience to the will of God. Thus in verse 23, he says, "And the scripture was fulfilled which saith, Abraham believed God, and it was imputed unto him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God." The declaration that Abraham believed God was confirmed, it was established by the offering of Isaac. Now then, understand the time frame as we go back into Genesis and look at this. This aspect that Abraham believed God and that Abraham was the friend of God is recorded in Genesis the 15th chapter and verse 6. There it is, the aspect. Abraham believed God. It was not until later, as we mentioned, Genesis 22, verses 1 through 19 in particular, that faith, that belief is made perfect, or it was complete. In Genesis the 15th chapter, you have the promise there of a great posterity, that Abraham would be the father of many people, of many nations, of many people. It would involve what is required considerable time, though, for the development of that promise. It wasn't going to take place overnight that God says, okay, you're going to be the father of many nations or many people. And Abraham believes that, and tomorrow there's all of a sudden a great nation. No, that's not going to happen. There's going to have to be time for that to be developed. And thus, at the time in which that statement is made by God, you're going to be the father of many people, of many nations. There's going to be what in regards to Abraham in works in relationship to that promise? Nothing. All that Abraham could do when God said that to him was to believe that he said what he said. And so, Genesis 15 and verse 6, Abraham believed God. There was no action that it was in relationship at that time to what God had said. It was very simply, God said it, I believe it, I accept it, is what we're seeing. And because of that acceptance of it, Abraham is justified. The word imputed is the Greek word logizomai. And logizomai means to reckon or to regard, to count. It deals with, in that sense, what is actual or what is factual. He is considered, he is reckoned, he is regarded. It is a fact that he is the friend of God. Actually, Abraham is not called the friend of God until we read in, as far as the scriptures are concerned, he's referred to that in 2 Chronicles chapter 20 and verse 7. And we could also compare Isaiah chapter 41 and verse 8 along that line. And let me get back to my notes. God regarded, He considered, He counted, He stated, this is a factual statement, Abraham is my friend. Why? Because he was faithful to God and he submitted to His will. And that's what we see in relationship to our faith, our love for God. We love God. How do I know that I love God? Because I'm obedient to His will. John 15 and verse 14, if you will. And other passages. You'll love me, you keep my commandment. You'll be called the friend of God. The friend of God is the one who is obedient to the commands. That's what Abraham did. But it's looking back on the situation in which he sees that Abraham, yes, continued in his faith and was obedient. Now then, verse 24, James says, Ye see then how that by works a man is justified and not by faith only. Now notice again the time frame. God promises to Abraham, you're going to be the father of many nations, many people. Abraham, simply because there's nothing associated with that promise, and notice the difference between a promise and a command in this as well. There's the promise of it by God. What do you do in relationship to a promise? You believe it. Abraham believed it. Later on, Genesis 22, there's the command in relationship to it. Go sacrifice Isaac. What does Abraham do? He obeys. He does it. And so, now then he says, Abraham's a friend of God. Why? Because he's obedient. His works showed him to be a man of faith. He really did believe what God said. Now, by the example, and here's what we see in verse 24 now. Ye see then, by this example of Abraham, we see that a man is justified by his works. That faith blesses only when it leads to a life of obedient faith. Faith has to be conjoined with the works to save him. Now, Martin Luther, and we mentioned him earlier, comes along, and when he gets to Romans 3 and verse 28, he adds the word only to faith, to teach that man is justified by faith only and not by deeds of the law. Now, this is exactly the opposite of what Martin Luther taught, and what Martin Luther actually added to the Bible in order to teach his false doctrine. And in reality, Martin Luther did exactly what the devil did when he deceived Eve. He added, Satan added the word not. Luther adds the word only. They both add one word to what God had said. They acted in exactly the same way. And while Satan deceived Eve, Luther has deceived multitudes of individuals by the adding of that one word to God's Word. You cannot hold to what Luther says and what the Bible says. They are two totally, completely different things. Now then, let me add here, and if we're dealing with the denominational world and you come up to this aspect and you're using James, how they are going to deal with this. It's important to understand. What they're going to say is, oh yes, works are necessary. But what are they going to say in relationship to those works? Those are works that are done after you become a Christian. That you have to be saved only by your faith. And then after you are saved, you have works of obedience. And so they are trying to tie in what James says. And if you go back to this illustration of Abraham, Abraham believed God and it was counted to him for righteousness. And so they say, see, he became righteous because of his faith. There was no works associated with it. Well, number one, there was no works associated with it because it was only a promise. There was no command relating to the promise yet. And so what they will say, what Abraham is an example of one who is a Christian who works. And so we are saved initially by our faith. And then that faith will then, after we are saved, lead to works. Now that's their response in this section of James. Now then, I bring it up at this time because of the importance of Rahab. Verse 25 in our text. Because he now adds, likewise also was not Rahab the harlot justified by works when she had received the messengers and had sent them out another way? Rahab is another illustration, another example of justification, that it is not by faith only, but that it is by also works of obedience. And James here, I believe, chooses Rahab to show the principle of justification was the same for the Gentiles as it was for the Jews. The Jews is seen in the illustration of Abraham, verse 23. Abraham, being a child of God, would show that the Christian, and let me use that illustration again, the Christian, one who already has obeyed the gospel, is justified by works. And that's what the denominational world will come along and say. You're saved by your faith only, and then you have to have works later on. What about Rahab, though? Rahab here is showing, and I believe is being used, that in becoming a child of God, one is justified by works based upon his faith. Was Rahab already a child of God? We find her story in Joshua, the 2nd chapter. And most of y'all were in my Joshua class, so this will be, in a sense, a rehash of that. But Israel was about to enter the Promised Land. She lived in Jericho. Spies were being sent into the city to see how the city could be taken. She lived on or in a house on the wall, and she hid the spies and then sent them out another way. Here, her faith that God had given the land of Canaan to the Israelites led her to hide the spies. And thus, she was justified by her works. She was not a child of God. She worked. She was justified. Thus, in using an application of this to Christianity in relationship to James, James is saying in relationship to Abraham, if you want to use this illustration, Abraham shows one who is in a right relationship with God, one who is a Christian, that individual is going to have faith even after he becomes a Christian. Now then, the denominational world teaching faith only, salvation, comes along and says, see, here's Abraham, and he had faith, and that faith saved him, and then later on he has works. Well, it does show that, but it doesn't show only that. But then he uses the illustration of Rahab, and they can't get around Rahab. Rahab was not a child of God. Using the illustration or applying it for today, Rahab, in that sense, was not a Christian. What did she do? She worked. And that works saved her. That, using application, the works caused her to become a Christian. She was saved by the works. Then, yes, works continued to follow after the salvation, as seen by Abraham. But thus we see, both in becoming a Christian and in living the Christian life, works are necessary in both aspects. And you cannot have true faith without having obedience, works, both before or in becoming a Christian and in being a Christian. Both are necessary. And thus, the denominational quibble that James is simply talking about a Christian and our works as a Christian are shown to be false by this illustration of Rahab. She was not one who was a child of God, and her works saved her. She was justified by her works. Now then, verse 26. For as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead also. Death, very simply, he shows as a separation. Physical death first is a separation of the spirit from the body. Spiritual death is a separation from God. And many other passages show this. Isaiah 59 verses 1 and verse 2. Ezekiel 18 verse 4. Ezekiel 18 and verse 20. James 1 verse 14 and 15. Romans 6 and verse 23, all of these passages show that spiritual death is very simply a separation from God. This also helps us to understand the second death that's described in Revelation. That second death is an eternal separation from God, because the sins of man have not been cleansed. It is a second death because there's the first death, a physical death. There's the second death, an eternal separation from God in a devil's hell in Revelation. That's why it's described as a second death. When we come out of sin, we are thus spoken of as one who is alive. Ephesians 2, verse 1 in particular, you who were dead in trespasses and sins, he has quickened or made alive in Christ. And we would see that in John the 3rd chapter, verses 1 through 7, in relationship to the new birth. The body is that which houses the spirit. The body is subject to decay, as we all know and are familiar. As we grow older, our body starts getting older. It starts decaying, breaking down. And the body in death then is dissolved. 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 1. If this earthly tabernacle is dissolved, we have a building of God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. And so this earthly body will be dissolved. It is spoken of by Peter that it is a tabernacle which must be put off. 2 Peter 1, verse 13 and verse 14. That it is made from the earth, Genesis 2 and verse 7, and this body is going to return to the earth at death, Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 7. Thus, that's our body. It is subject to decay. It's going to be dissolved. It is a tabernacle that we must put off. It's a tabernacle which houses the spirit. It's made from the dust of the earth, and in the dust it's going to return. The spirit here refers to the nature of man that is immortal and that returns to God at death. So when the body, it decays, it goes into the grave, it dissolves, the spirit, which has been housed in the body, returns to God, who gave the spirit. And the spirit enters that Hadean realm, either in paradise for those individuals who have lived righteous, or Tartarus for those individuals who have not lived according to God's standard. And in that Hadean realm, they wait for the judgment. And at the second coming of Christ, the spirit, Christ is going to come. He's going to raise the body, and we're going to be given an immortal body. Our spirits will join back with that immortal body. We will go to judgment, and those at the judgment, those who are in that paradise, in that Hadean realm, they're going to enter into heaven, and those in Tartarus will enter into hell, that permanent place of separation from God, or being blessed with God in heaven. Faith without works is spiritual death. Spiritual separation from God. Now, it takes both the body and the spirit to make physical life. Sometimes we ask the question, when does death occur? Well, very simple answer is when the spirit leaves the body. That's death. Now, that might argue and discuss, and it might not be an easy answer as to when does the spirit leave the body. But when it does leave the body, that's death. To make life, you have to have both, body and spirit. It takes both faith and works to make spiritual life. The works that make faith alive are works that God has commanded. Remember, that's what we're discussing with. These principles apply both to the Christian and to the non-Christian both alike. That one who has not obeyed the gospel, in order to have spiritual life, he has to have faith and works. The Christian, in order to continue to be spiritually alive, he must have faith and works. Now then, this that James is writing is yes, being written to Christians to prompt them to faithfulness in God's work. You continue to work. Now, James' conclusion is that justification is by faith and works. And this is kind of a conclusion of this whole section, that justification is by faith and works is established, one, by an analogy, verses 14 and 15. Second, by a demonstration, verses 17 and verse 18. Third, by examples. First, in the case of the demons, verse 19. Second, in the case of Abraham, verses 21 through 23. Third, in the case of Rahab the harlot, verse 25. Then, going on, James' conclusion that justification is by faith and works is established by fourth, inspired affirmation. This is the entire section, verses 14 through 26. And then an appeal to common sense, verse 24. So that is, in a sense, the conclusion that we see within this entire section. Now then, chapter 3, verses 1 through 18. We go back now to the proved man is the one who controls his tongue. In chapter 3 and verse 1, he begins by saying, "My brethren, be not many masters, knowing that we shall receive the greater condemnation." The rest of this chapter, chapter 3, is going to be based on this verse. Brethren, notice the word brethren. He is speaking to Christians in this context. He says, be not. It is a present imperative, which is basically a command. And he says, be not, from the standpoint, you stop this action that is in progress. So you have something that is taking place, and he's saying, stop this action. Be not many masters. Masters is from the Greek word didaskalos, and it literally means teacher. Be not many teachers. Master, in the King James, is the Old English word that is a shortened form of schoolmaster. So he's saying, King James says, my brethren, be not many schoolmasters is the idea, but it's a shortened form, thus be not many masters. It's a school teacher, a schoolmaster, someone who is a teacher. The Jews to whom James is writing had a desire to be public teachers, very possibly more from a standpoint of honor, or as a means of honor than anything else. There was more influence, more power that was attached to being a teacher. Notice along that line, 1 Timothy 1 and verse 7. So there was that aspect, a desire to be public teachers, probably as a means of honor first, but also second, because of the Roman guild system. The son had to pursue the trade of the father. The only exceptions to that were twofold. He could join the army, or he could become a rabbi. And so, many times, in order to escape the occupation of the father, they didn't want to go into the army. So, in order to escape that, they would become a rabbi. Now then, understand that background. They desired to be public teachers, but they desired it without any regard for the qualifications of the office. They were teaching publicly, and James is very basically telling them, stop it. You stop being these type of public teachers. Words are worthless without action. And go back to Jesus' condemnation of the Pharisees and scribes in Matthew the 23rd chapter and verses 8 through verse 10 in particular, and see how he deals with, here's these individuals who want these places of honor, and how that they will say these things, but there's nothing behind them. There's no action behind them. They say these things, but they don't do them themselves. And so James is saying, in a certain sense, we are not to rush into teaching, and especially publicly, without the proper preparation and respect for it. And again, you might consider 1 Timothy 4, verses 13 through 16 along that line. James is not here, though, condemning teachers who are able to teach and who have the respect for teaching. He is condemning those who are only doing it for the notoriety of it. Look at me, I'm a teacher. And they can boastfully, strut around as a result because they're a public teacher, as opposed to someone else over here who's not. That's what he's condemning here. He's not trying to stop people from being teachers either. But he is, within this context, trying to impress upon them the responsibilities and obligations connected with it. Now then, from one standpoint, we are all to be teachers. Study these passages sometimes. Hebrews, the 5th chapter, verses 12 through chapter 6 and verse 1, where he condemns these Jews from when the time ye ought to be teachers, you have need that one teach you again what be the first principles of the oracles of God. 1 Timothy 2, verse 15, we are to study to show ourselves approved unto God. We are to be 1 Peter 3, verse 15, always ready to give an answer. Ephesians 4, verses 11 through 15. Now, let me set forth that we teach in three ways. We teach first by conversation of life, or our manner of life. The way in which we live teaches something. We would see the principle of that in Matthew the 5th chapter, verses 13 through 16. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify God. What is it? Your life is teaching something. So we teach by our life. Second, we teach indirectly by our prayers, by our giving. When we give upon the first day of the week, and the congregation then, or the elders, take that money and they support someone in going out into the mission field and supporting a preacher, then you are teaching indirectly. Study the book of Philippians along that line. Third, we teach directly. And there's two ways in relationship to that, in teaching directly. There is a public teaching and a private teaching. Now, not everyone is to be a public teacher. We understand that. Not everyone has the qualifications and has the right to be a public teacher. Women are not to be public teachers in that regard. But everyone has the obligation to be a teacher and teaching in that direct manner in a private way. Now then, James is not denigrating and saying, don't be a teacher. But when we take it upon ourselves to teach, we're dealing, and we need to understand that we're dealing with people's souls and other people's souls. That individual who is being taught, we're dealing with that individual's soul. We're also dealing with our soul. My soul is going to be saved as to whether or not I am obedient to the gospel of Christ in my teaching. And so I have to have the proper respect for it myself in order to be able to teach someone else. We need to be careful in our Bible classes. We set up Bible classes today, and we have a need for teachers, we think. And what we'll do, and you can see it in congregations all over the brotherhood, we set up, and we got to have this age group and this age group and this age group. And so we set up X number of classes. And thus, we've got to have that X number of classes according generally to age levels. Well, if we've got X number of classes, if we've got 5 classes, or we've got 10 classes, or we've got 15 classes, then we've got to have that many teachers. And so what do? We make an announcement. We need teachers. Anyone who wants to teach, let us know. And we just open it up for anyone who wants to teach to come in and take a class to teach. And in reality, oftentimes the ones who desire to be teachers are the ones who really need to be taught for a few years. And what ends up is, and a lot of times those also who want to be teachers are those who are false teachers. They want to start infiltrating their false teaching into the congregation. And so we end up having to combat the false teaching that they do. And what happens is they go to these denominational sources to find out what to teach. Well, I've got a class now. I've got to find something to teach. So they go up and they get this commentary that's produced by some denominational source, and, well, we're just going to follow this. And sad to say, a lot of the publications in the churches of Christ today are nothing more than denominational material with our cover on it. And so we go through and we give this material to that individual, and you teach that, and it's denominational material, and that individual doesn't have the knowledge and wherewithal to say, well, this is error, and get out of it, and to start teaching the truth. What would be far better is that we limit the number of Bible classes that we have to the number of qualified teachers that we have. If we have only one person who's qualified to teach, then only have one Bible class. If you've got 5 people who are qualified to teach, have 5 Bible classes. Why have more Bible classes than what you have qualified teachers? And then start getting people in to teach these classes that have no qualifications to teach. Let me finish verse 1 very briefly. He then says, greater condemnation. It's a Greek word, meson-krina. And it's from these 2 Greek words, greater condemnation, mesion, greater, and krima, judgment. And you might tie in these passages with it, Mark the 12th chapter and verse 40, Luke the 20th chapter and verse 47. And it would be maybe better translated as the American Standard does here, a severe judgment. Public teachers have a greater standard of judgment than other individuals. Why? Because he's responsible not only for his own soul, he's also responsible for those individuals whom he is teaching. And you let that individual teach false doctrine, those individuals who hear him and follow that false doctrine are going to be lost. He's going to have a greater condemnation, a severer judgment upon him. Well, our time is up. I hope that this has been profitable to you, and that you'll continue to study in God's Word, and that we will continue on in our study through the book of James.